June 16, 1943, 25,000 feet over the Solomon Islands. A lone B-17 bomber appeared on Japanese radar. One aircraft, no fighter escort, flying straight and level toward Bougainville, the most heavily defended enemy stronghold in the South Pacific. 17-0 fighters scrambled to intercept. Standard engagement time for a single bomber, 2 minutes, maybe 3 if the crew fought hard. What happened next violated every assumption about aerial combat in the Pacific theater. The battle lasted minutes. When the B-17 finally broke contact and limped toward Allied territory, Japanese pilots filed reports that read like fiction. Enemy bomber, abnormal firepower, engaged from all angles, 5 fighters lost, bomber survived. 5 Zeros destroyed by 1 bomber. In a knife fight that should have ended in seconds. The American plane that did this, officially designated B-17E tail number 412666, made it back to base. Ground crews counted the damage, 187 bullet holes and 5 cannon shell impacts. The main wing spar was severed. The vertical stabilizer hung by a strip of aluminum. The hydraulic system was gone. The oxygen system was destroyed. By every engineering principle, the plane should have disintegrated in midair. The pilot who landed it, Captain Jay, was bleeding from 7 wounds. His bombardier was dead in the nose. His co-pilot was unconscious. 3 other crew members were wounded. Command asked the obvious question: how did 1 bomber survive 17 fighters? The answer would force the Army Air Forces to rewrite their technical manuals. But first, intelligence had to figure out what happened. And for 3 months they couldn't. The B-17 that fought 17 Zeros shouldn't have been in the air at all. Old 666, as the ground crews called it, had a reputation, not the good kind. In the 43rd Bomb Group stationed in Port New Guinea, pilots avoided this plane like a disease. It sat at the end of the runway, leaking oil, gathering rust, waiting to be stripped for parts. The maintenance logs told the story. This airframe had flown too many missions. The engines were worn out. The frame was bent. The metal skin was riddled with patches covering old bullet holes. Every system was borderline inoperable. More critically, every crew that flew it came back reporting malfunctions. The oxygen system failed at altitude. The heating system didn't work. The intercoms cut out mid-mission. The control cables felt loose. The vibration at cruising speed made instruments unreadable. Other pilots had a name for it: the coffin with wings. Standard procedure called for retirement after a certain number of combat hours. Old 666 had exceeded that limit by 30%. By regulation, it should have been declared non-airworthy and scrapped. But in 1943 in New Guinea, nothing was standard. The Pacific Theater operated on a logistics knife edge. Every bomber mattered, even the dying ones. So old 666 sat in the boneyard, technically flight-capable, practically untouchable. No squadron commander would assign it to a crew. No pilot would volunteer for it. Except one. Captain Jay arrived in New Guinea in early 1943 with a problem. He was an excellent pilot, everyone acknowledged that. He had the technical skills, the flying hours, the cool head under pressure. He also had a discipline record that made commanders nervous. Didn't salute properly. He showed up to briefings late. He wore his uniform like he'd slept in it. He asked too many questions about doctrine. He argued with superior officers about tactics. In the rigid, by-the-book culture of the Army Air Forces, was a misfit. He'd bounced between 3 different squadrons in 6 months. Nobody wanted the headache. When he arrived at the 43rd Bomb Group, the squadron commander looked at his file and made a decision. No crew assignment. No aircraft assignment. Could fly as a spare co-pilot on missions that needed extra bodies. For a pilot with skills, this was humiliating, but he saw an opportunity. He walked out to the boneyard and found old 666 sitting in the tall grass. He looked at the battered fuselage, the oil-stained wings, the patched bullet holes. The maintenance chief laughed when said he wanted it. That thing's a lemon, it's scheduled for scrap, you're wasting your time. Didn't care. He recruited a crew of similar outcasts, men who'd been rejected by other pilots or couldn't get crew positions. They called themselves the Eager Beavers, a sarcastic name for guys who volunteered for missions nobody else wanted, and then did something that would eventually get him either court-martialed or decorated. He started modifying the plane, without authorization, without paperwork, without telling anyone what he was doing. 3 months after claimed old 666, intelligence started noticing a pattern. A particular B-17, always flying reconnaissance missions alone, always returning shot up, always completing the mission, was racking up a kill count that didn't make sense. The plane's combat reports showed 6 confirmed enemy fighters destroyed over 3 months. For a lone bomber operating without escort, this was statistically impossible. Standard bomber tactics relied on formation flying. Bombers flew in groups specifically because a single B-17 couldn't defend itself against determined fighter attack. The doctrine was clear. Survival came from mutual fire support. But old 666 was flying solo missions, deep into enemy territory, over heavily defended targets, and not only surviving, actively destroying attackers. Command formed a theory. The aircraft was either misreporting, claiming kills it didn't achieve, or operating with standard armament but getting exceptionally lucky. To test this, maintenance was ordered to inspect old 666 after each mission, count the gun positions, verify the armament matched standard configuration. The inspection reports came back consistent: 13 machine gun positions, standard B-17E configuration, all guns accounted for. Theory confirmed: old 666 wasn't special, and his crew were just skilled or lucky. But intelligence analysts found contradictions in the data. Japanese fighter pilots who survived encounters with old 666, when interrogated after being shot down on subsequent missions, described abnormal defensive fire. One pilot reported simultaneous fire from more than 15 positions. Another described the bomber as unusually aggressive for a lone aircraft. The Americans dismissed this as combat confusion. Pilots under stress overestimate threats, standard psychological response. Then, in May 1943, a reconnaissance mission over Rabaul went wrong. His plane was jumped by 8 Zeros. The engagement lasted 12 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. Old 666 shot down 2 fighters. Both Zeros disintegrated midair from catastrophic damage to engine and cockpit areas. The ground crew chief inspected the plane after it landed and found something that didn't match the reports. The ammunition expenditure was enormous. Old 666 had burned through 12,000 rounds, more than twice what 13 guns should fire in a 12-minute engagement. He counted the ejection ports on the fuselage: 13 positions, standard configuration. The math didn't work, but he filed a standard report anyway. Nobody wanted paperwork headaches over ammunition accounting errors. Command's theory held: old 666 was standard, was just effective. They were completely wrong. But proving it would require a crisis. June 1943, Allied command needed reconnaissance photos of Bougainville. The mission profile was brutal: fly 600 miles into enemy territory, photograph the airfields at low speed while maintaining straight-hand level flight for 20 minutes. Do this over the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Solomons. No bomber group wanted the assignment. The survival probability was rated at less than 30%. Volunteered. Command approved because they didn't have another option. They also approved because intelligence had formed a second theory about old 666's success. The theory's defensive tactics were superior. Standard bomber doctrine taught defensive gunnery based on maximum range engagement. Fire at incoming fighters from 1,000 yards out. Maintain continuous suppressive fire. Force the attacker to break off early. Intelligence believes crew trained differently. Maybe they held fire longer. Maybe they coordinated their gun positions better. Maybe they had superior target tracking. The theory made sense. It explained the high ammunition expenditure, the effective kills, the survival rate. To test this, Command sent observers to interview crew before the Bougainville mission. The observers reported back. As gunners refused to discuss tactics. They cited operational security, but they showed exceptional discipline and confidence. Theory validated. Success came from better training, not better equipment. Command approved the suicide mission with this understanding. If tactics were transferable, they could train other bomber crews the same way. His survival would prove the doctrine. On June 15th, and his crew took off for Bougainville at 600 hours. Intelligent believed they understood old 666's advantage. Better crew, better tactics, standard equipment. All three assumptions were wrong. June 16th, 800 hours. Old 666 reached the target area. 17-0 scrambled. Radio operators at Allied bases monitored the engagement from 600 miles away. They heard fragments of transmission. His voice, calm despite the static and interference. Brief reports of fighter contacts. Then silence. For 90 minutes, nobody knew if the bomber was still in the air. Then at 10:30 hours, a radar station in New Guinea picked up a single aircraft signature. Slow, low altitude, heading southeast. Old 666 appeared over port at 1100 hours. The plane looked like it had flown through a sawmill. The metal skin was shredded. The tail section was barely attached. One engine was dead. The landing gear deployed asymmetrically. The hydraulics were gone, and the crew had hand-cranked the wheels down. Brought it in without brakes. The bomber rolled 3,000 feet past the runway markers before friction alone stopped it in the grass. Ambulances reached the plane. The scene inside was carnage. Was unconscious, soaked in blood. The bombardier was dead. 3 other crew members were wounded. The cabin was ankle-deep in spent shell casings and blood. Ground crews counted the damage later that day. 187 bullet holes, 5 cannon shell impacts, main wing spar severed, control cables damaged, oxygen system destroyed, hydraulic system empty. And something else they couldn't immediately explain. The ammunition bays were empty. Every gun had been fired to depletion. Command gathered the reports. Japanese fighter pilots 5 confirmed destroyed. Battle duration 40 minutes. Ammunition expenditure estimated 18,000 rounds. The math still didn't work. 13 gun positions couldn't fire 18,000 rounds in 40 minutes. The rate of fire and barrel cooling requirements made it physically impossible. Engineering conducted an emergency inspection while was in surgery. They counted gun positions again, 13, standard configuration. But when they counted ammunition feed systems, they found something that made no sense. There were 19 ammunition chutes running through the fuselage. 19. Not 13. The lead engineer filed a report flagged as urgent. Aircraft 412666 shows evidence of unauthorized modification. Nature of modifications unclear. Recommend immediate investigation. But was unconscious. His crew refused to talk, citing orders they claimed came from the captain. And the plane itself looked like it had been assembled from scrap metal and desperation. Intelligence reviewed every piece of data, the impossible kill count, the absurd ammunition expenditure, the survival against overwhelming odds, the mysterious extra ammunition feeds. Nobody understood, not command, not intelligence. Not even the maintenance crews, who'd been inspecting the plane for 3 months. The answer existed. It was written in welding scars on old 666's aluminum skin. It was documented in missing parts from wrecked fighters scattered across the port airfield. But regulations said a B-17E carried 13 guns. The manual said additional armament would make the aircraft. The doctrine said what did was impossible. Nobody thought to question whether cared about regulations. The answer wasn't in better training or superior tactics. It was in scrap metal. When claimed old 666 in early 1943, he saw what everyone else saw: a dying bomber with failing systems and a reputation for getting crews killed. But where others saw liability, saw opportunity. Specifically, he saw a plane that was already written off. Nobody cared what happened to it. Nobody was watching. And had a theory about why bombers died. Standard B-17E defensive armament, 13 machine gun positions. Sounds impressive until you map the coverage. The nose, where German and Japanese fighters preferred to attack, was protected by a single .30 caliber machine gun, a weapon that fired bullets the diameter of a pencil. Against a fighter attacking head-on at 300 miles per hour, that gun was decorative. Luftwaffe and Japanese fighter doctrine had adapted: attack from the front, kill the pilot. The bomber's rear guns couldn't rotate forward. The waist guns couldn't track a head-on target. The nose gunner had one small gun that couldn't stop a determined attack. This weakness killed bombers. Doctrine acknowledged it, but doctrine said adding more weight to the nose would make the aircraft unstable. The engineering manuals were clear. Maximum defensive armament was 13 positions. Additional guns would exceed structural load limits. Looked at those manuals and made a calculation. Old 666 was already outside regulations, already scheduled for scrap, already deemed by normal standards. What if you ignored the weight limits? He started scavenging. Port Airfield in 1943 was littered with wrecked aircraft, P-38 fighters that had crashed, B-17s that had been cannibalized for parts. Every week, more wreckage arrived. And his crew, working at night, without authorization, began stripping weapons from the wrecks. Not the standard .30 caliber guns, heavy .50 caliber machine guns, weapons that fired bullets the size of a finger. Bullets that could punch through engine blocks and tear wings off. They bolted twin .50 cals into the nose compartment where the single .30 cal sat. They added extra guns in the waist positions. They mounted a gun in the radio room. They put guns in positions the manual said didn't exist. But's masterpiece was a modification that violated every principle of bomber design. He mounted a fixed .50 caliber machine gun to the floor of the cockpit, directly between his feet. He rigged a firing button to his control yoke. He painted a crosshair on his windshield for aiming. This turned the pilot into a gunner. It meant could aim the entire 32,000-pound bomber like a fighter plane and fire directly forward. The engineering officers who eventually discovered this modification couldn't believe it was real. You're telling me he pointed a 4-engine bomber at enemy fighters and shot at them, like a P-51? That's exactly what he did. By the time was finished, old 666 carried 19 machine guns, 6 more than standard configuration. Every single one a heavy .50 caliber except the original .30 cal they left in for paperwork compliance. The weight was enormous. The modifications added over 600 pounds of steel, ammunition, and mounting hardware to an airframe that was already overweight and exhausted. Maintenance officers did the math and told it wouldn't fly. The center of gravity was wrong. The control surfaces wouldn't compensate. The engines couldn't handle the load. The plane would be too slow, too heavy, too unstable. Told them he wasn't planning to fly in formation. He was planning to fly alone. Command hated it. When they finally discovered what had done, 3 months after he'd started flying combat missions in the modified bomber, the engineering department filed formal objections. Aircraft 412666 has been modified beyond acceptable parameters. Additional armament exceeds maximum takeoff weight by 12%. Control stability is compromised. Flight characteristics are unpredictable. The aircraft is unsafe and should be grounded immediately. Response: then why am I still alive? He had a point. By June 1943, old 666 had flown 15 combat missions, deep reconnaissance runs into heavily defended territory. Solo, no fighter escort, every mission should have been suicide. Came back every time, shot up but alive. And with confirmed kills that kept adding up. Command had a choice: court-martial him for unauthorized modifications or admit the modifications worked. The Bougainville mission forced their hand. When volunteered for the reconnaissance run over the most defended target in the South Pacific, nobody else stepped forward. Every experienced pilot knew the odds. Fly straight and level for 20 minutes over an island with radar, heavy anti-aircraft guns, and a full fighter squadron. Solo. The math was simple. You'd be dead before you finished the photo run. But had something no other pilot had. He had a bomber that could fight back from every angle simultaneously. He had firepower that Japanese fighter pilots weren't expecting. He had a Frankenstein monster built from junkyard scraps that shouldn't fly but refused to die. Command approved the mission because they were desperate for the intelligence. They also quietly hoped that if survived, it would prove his modifications weren't insane. What nobody anticipated was just how badly things would go wrong, and how badly the enemy would underestimate what they were attacking. June 16th, 800 hours, 17 Zeros dove on old 666. The Japanese pilots saw exactly what they expected. Alone, battered B-17 limping along at 25,000 feet. Standard procedure, attack from the front where the bomber was weak, kill the pilot, mission over in 2 minutes. The lead Zero pilot, later identified from wreckage, lined up his attack run. He came in fast from 12 o'clock high. He expected to see one small .30 caliber gun pointing at him from the nose. Instead, 3 heavy machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Pressed the button on his control yoke. The fixed gun between his feet roared. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Joe triggered the twin .50 cals. 3 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged on the attacking fighter at a combined rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The Zero didn't just take damage, it disintegrated. The engine exploded, the cockpit shattered, the wings folded. The fighter went from a coherent aircraft to a cloud of debris in less than 1 second. The other 16 Zeros adjusted their tactics immediately. This wasn't a standard bomber, this was something else. They split into groups. 4 attacked from the front, 2 came in from the sides, 3 circled to attack the tail. They planned to overwhelm the defenses with simultaneous attacks from all angles. It was a sound tactical decision. It should have worked. But old 666 wasn't defending from 13 positions. It was defending from 19. And every position had overlapping fields of fire and his crew had spent months perfecting. The battle turned into a knife fight in the sky. The Zeros pressed their attacks with determination. They were elite pilots. They'd been fighting in the Pacific for years. They understood bomber tactics. But they'd never fought a bomber that behaved like a fighter. They'd never encountered a pilot who pointed his aircraft directly at attacking fighters and fired. They'd never faced defensive fire this concentrated. 2 more Zeros went down in the first 5 minutes. 1 lost a wing to a burst from the waist guns. 1 took fire from 3 positions simultaneously and exploded. Then a 20 cannon shell from a Zero punched through the nose and detonated inside the bombardier compartment. Joe was thrown backward by the blast. Shrapnel tore through his abdomen and neck. Blood poured across the floor. The other crew members tried to pull him back to the radio room to treat his wounds. Pushed them away. He could see another Zero lining up for a frontal attack. The Japanese pilot thought the nose guns were silenced. Crawled back to his guns. He couldn't stand, so he pulled himself up using the gun mount. His hands were slick with blood. His vision was blurring. But the Zero was getting closer, and if it killed, everyone died. He held the triggers down. The twin .50 cals hammered. Tracers lashed out and caught the Zero's wing root. The wing snapped off. The fighter spun out of control and crashed into the ocean below. Collapsed, he had nothing left, but he'd bought them time. In the cockpit, fought his own battle. A bullet had shattered his left leg. Another had torn through his wrist. The instrument panel exploded from a cannon shell. Glass and metal fragments peppered his face. The control yoke was slippery with hydraulic fluid and blood. The pain was absolute, white-hot and overwhelming. But if he let go of the controls, the heavy nose would drop, and they'd spin into the ocean. He flew with his right hand and right leg, fighting the massive weight of the aircraft while his body tried to shut down. The oxygen system was destroyed. which meant they were slowly suffocating at 25,000 feet. The thin air made everything feel distant and dreamlike. The Zeros kept attacking. For 40 minutes, wave after wave. But the mathematics of the engagement were against them. Old 666's 19 guns created an envelope of defensive fire that was nearly impenetrable. Every approach vector was covered. Every attack run met with concentrated fire from multiple positions. 2 more Zeros fell, 5 total destroyed. The remaining Japanese fighters broke off. They were low on fuel and ammunition. They'd lost nearly a third of their force, and the bomber, impossibly, was still flying. But barely. Old 666 was dying. The control cables were shredded. The hydraulics were gone. The oxygen was depleted. The electrical system was failing. 187 bullet holes and 5 cannon impacts had turned the airframe into Swiss cheese. Looked at his instruments through vision that was narrowing to a tunnel. He looked at his watch. The photo run was complete. They had the pictures. The mission was accomplished. Now they just had to fly 600 miles back to base, with 1 good arm, 1 good leg, most of his blood outside his body. And a plane that should have fallen apart 10 minutes ago. He pointed the nose southeast and pushed the throttles forward. The old engines, somehow, still responded. Old 666 made it back to port at 1100 hours. Landed the plane, without brakes, without hydraulics, on 1 good leg, and rolled it to a stop in the grass beyond the runway. He survived. His crew survived. Everyone except Joe. The photos they'd taken were perfect, because had refused to break off the mission, refused to evade, refused to turn back. The reconnaissance images gave Allied command complete intelligence on Bougainville's defenses. When Marines landed 3 months later, they knew exactly where every bunker, every gun, every aircraft was positioned. Those photos saved thousands of lives. The cost: 1 bombardier dead, 1 pilot and 3 crew members wounded, 1 bomber destroyed beyond repair. Command conducted the investigation while was in surgery. They counted the guns. 19. They measured the modifications. Over 600 pounds overweight. They read the engineering reports that said the plane was. Then they read the combat report. 5 enemy fighters confirmed destroyed. 40-minute engagement against 17 attackers. Mission completed. Aircraft returned to base. The regulations said it was impossible. The results said it happened. The Army Air Forces had a choice: punish for violating every rule in the technical manual, or admit the manual was wrong. They chose admission, with decorations. Captain Jay received the Medal of Honor. Second Lieutenant Joe received the Medal of Honor posthumously. It was the only time in history that 2 members of the same bomber crew received the nation's highest award for the same mission. The rest of the Eager Beavers, every surviving crew member, received the Distinguished Flying Cross. They became the most decorated bomber crew in American history. But the greater legacy was doctrinal. The engineering teams studied old 666's wreckage. They analyzed its modifications. They realized he'd identified a fatal flaw in bomber design that doctrine had dismissed as unfixable. The nose was weak. Everyone knew it. But doctrine said you couldn't add more guns without destabilizing the aircraft. Proved that was wrong. You could add guns, the plane would fly. And it would survive encounters that killed standard bombers. 6 months after the Bougainville mission, Boeing rolled out a new variant. The B-17G, the most prominent feature was a chin turret mounted directly under the nose. A powered, remote-controlled twin .50 caliber gun position. Designed specifically to defend against head-on fighter attacks. It was modification, refined and factory installed. The Frankenstein experiment became the new standard. By 1944, every B-17 rolling off the production line had the chin turret. Thousands of bombers, tens of thousands of who lived because the nose was no longer a weakness. Old 666 itself never flew again. It was too damaged. The airframe was cut up and scrapped. Its aluminum was recycled, turned into pots and pans or siding for houses. But for one impossible morning in June 1943, it had been the deadliest bomber in the Pacific, built from junkyard scraps by a misfit pilot who didn't care about regulations, who understood that doctrine is written by people who never been shot at by 17 fighters at once. How did one bomber survive 17 fighters and kill 5 of them? Doctrine said 13 guns, maximum weight, stay in formation. Said 19 guns, ignore weight, fly alone. Physics didn't care about paperwork. Regulations aren't wrong. Their assumptions are outdated the moment someone finds a better way to stay alive. Modern fighter doctrine still teaches the lesson. Rules are written from past experience. Innovation comes from questioning whether those rules still apply. Spent a year in hospitals. They wanted to amputate his leg. He refused. He told them he needed it to fly. He endured multiple surgeries, infections, bone grafts. He fought recovery the way he'd fought the Zeros, by refusing to accept the obvious outcome. He walked again, with a limp he'd carry for life, but he walked. He never called himself a hero. When asked about the mission, he always redirected to, "Joe died defending the rest of us." He's the one who deserves to be remembered. But history remembers them both. The misfit pilot and the bombardier who wouldn't quit. The junk plane that shouldn't fly. The regulations that said it was impossible and the men who proved regulations wrong. June 16, 1943. 1 bomber, 17 fighters, 5 kills, 187 bullet holes. Everyone survived, except the one who made sure they did. The doctrine changed, the manual was rewritten, the lesson remains.